Welcome to this special broadcast. This is a third of an infrequent series of programs that I've participated in here on Marin TV. I'm Peter B. Collins, and today we're going to take a look at the latest situation regarding Pacifica Radio and Berkeley-based community station KPFA. Now, most viewers and those who are regular listeners of KPFA know that the station and the network remain in a dysfunctional mode, on the edge of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy was forestalled by a loan of more than $3 million that will be coming due in the not too distant future. Recent efforts to get financial records updated for required audits were started, but are once again stalled. The last time we talked, Bill Crozier was the interim executive director of Pacifica, and I'll note that there's been high turnover in that position. We're now on the second person replacing Bill Crozier, and there have been at least 5 executive directors in the last 5 years or so. I'd like to first let you know that I am agnostic about the various factions and the long-term struggles at Pacifica and KPFA. I'm a listener, I have been a donor, but my background is in commercial radio on AM and FM in Chicago and here in the Bay Area. I've been a longtime supporter of KPFA. I've appeared on some programs there, but I've never worked there. And I am not a part of any of the slates or other factions that have developed over the years. My interest is in the sustainability and preservation of what I consider to be a very important community asset. And I would say, at a time when the corporate media is often not doing the job we expect of them, KPFA is more significant than ever, and its programming, I think, fills a very vital need in our area, our community. In a few minutes, our panel here will talk about some of the challenges faced by KPFA and Pacifica and some of the tough choices that lie ahead. Peter Franck is an attorney and past president of the Pacifica Network. Peter, thanks for being with us again.
Thank you.
And Sharon Adams is a member of the KPFA local station board and serves as the LSB treasurer. Thanks for being with us here.
Thank you, Peter.
And shortly, Carole Travis, who is currently a member of the Pacifica National Board, will join us by Skype. But first, we want to explore the elements of a successful community radio station that serves the New York metropolitan area. WFMU is based in Jersey City, and General Manager Ken Freedman joins us right now by Skype. Ken, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, I've listened a little bit online to WFMU, and I've browsed through your website, and you have a remarkable lineup of freeform music programming and community programs that serve various audiences in your service area. You have a primary FM signal and what I think are either translators, what we would call repeaters, or low power systems that extend your signal beyond the zone of the primary FM transmitter. But since 1993, WFMU has been very active in programming online. I'd like you to tell our viewers a little bit about your station and about that split between what's on the RF, the radio frequencies, what's online, and what draws an audience, and what produces the contributions that sustain your efforts.
Well, WFMU has been on the air for 60 years. This year is our 60th anniversary, and in many ways, we were a child of Pacifica because WFMU, when it became a freeform station in 1968 full-time, was very heavily influenced by WBAI in New York City. I'm a longtime listener and donor and volunteer at WBAI, and still listen to BAI. WFMU became independent of Uppsala College, our former licensee and owner, when the college went bankrupt in 1994. That period of time coincided with an explosion in the web, and we had a huge budget deficit as soon as we became independent of the college, and we looked to the internet as a way of growing our audience and growing our revenue. So we really embraced the internet very, very aggressively in the early 90s and mid 90s. And at this point now, we do have 4 FM stations in the New York region, all broadcasting the same thing. As you say, they're translators or low power repeaters. But the overwhelming majority of our listeners are online these days. Probably 3 to 4 times as many people listen online as listen over FM. Although it is very common for people to listen by both means, to listen to an FM signal if they're in their car, and then to turn on the signal online if they're at work or perhaps out of range. They can listen on their phone. So we've had a great deal of activity online in terms of community building, building a healthy online community that translates into a healthy real world community. We have about 5 channels of programming. WFMU proper is one of those channels, and we have 4 other channels, and then we have about 20 podcasts. We do a great deal of online fundraising as well, through email marketing and text to give, and the overwhelming majority of our fundraising comes in through the website and through mobile, as opposed to coming in over telephones.
And I understand that your revenue from listener contributions is approaching $2 million a year.
Yeah, it sometimes exceeds 2 million, but it's around $2 million a year.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit, because in looking at your website, you stream the FM signal, and as you mentioned, you have additional channels, but you have a rich archive of programs and podcasts. And I'm a podcaster myself, and one of the things that I discovered is that people don't really consider what we would call an expiration date on podcasts. And when they search by subject or the name of a guest who you talk to, I find that people will listen to podcasts that are 5, 6, 7 years old. And that's a major change, because we're really used to thinking of this mass media as something that is so perishable. You listen in your car, and when it's over, it's over. But the shelf life of archived programming, including podcasts, is much greater, and it enables you to reach an audience that searches at iTunes or at Google or elsewhere. I find that a way to really evangelize about the program source. And I think that is a fundamental that KPFA could look at, because yes, KPFA archives its programs, but they, as far as I know, have a single stream online. And there are plenty of people who would love to generate new programs, so that is a way to expand the menu without having to build new facilities.
Yeah, we began archiving our programming in 2001 full time. And we engage in a lot of direct licensing with record labels and artists. So we got permission from a great deal of them to keep our archives online permanently. So we have at this point about 18 years of archives. And that's more than one channel. We have many, I don't know, 18 times probably 2 or 3 in terms of how many years of programming we have available on demand. And most of the listening actually does take place on demand these days. There are far more people who listen on the internet who listen to a program after it concludes than those who are listening to it live. But even though we have fewer listeners listening live, it feels like we have more, because we have a very lively, positive online community engaging in chat, which surrounds every program. So the chat is a very important part of our online community building, and then that same chat community does spill over into the real world via meetups in different cities, and then it also becomes a real big force during fundraising time, where the community is actually encouraging itself to support the station, as opposed to the station asking the community to support it.
And
if you follow me.
Ken, you get a whole lot of data online that you can't really get, particularly for a community station, from Nielsen ratings or other sources. And it's fascinating to me to see how you can reach well beyond the footprint of your broadcast signal. And so it really creates a worldwide opportunity to build audience. What do your analytics show you about the gross numbers of people who tap into your streams or listen to recorded programming each month? And do you have exotic listeners in Thailand and Abu Dhabi?
Yeah, we do. We have listeners all over the world, and we do get some geographic stats so you can see where they're listening from. I wish I could show some of those to you right now. It's really, really fun to look at, to see where people are listening all over the world in real time. But we get lots of interesting metrics like that. We also let the listeners interact with our content a great deal. We let them build lists of their favorite songs, lists of their favorite programs, and then they can then take those lists and do various things with them. So we try to take a lot of the data surrounding the programming and make it available to the listeners, and then certainly online digital media gives you all sorts of metrics that you can't possibly get with FM broadcasting.
Ken, do you believe that WFMU could survive without terrestrial signals?
Yeah, there's no question we could.
All right. Peter, Sharon, do you have any questions for Ken?
Yeah. Ken, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you paint us briefly a picture of what a modernized Pacifica station, which would be a little bit different from what yours is, what a modernized Pacifica station would and could look like?
Well, I think that it's actually a really, really great opportunity for Pacifica right now, because I think the mood in the country and the mood among a lot of younger people is very much in line with Pacifica's mission. I do think that the programming needs to become, I think the programs should probably be longer and organized in such a way as to maximize audience growth while still retaining the Pacifica mission. And I think that can be done in a whole variety of ways. I don't think I want to get into all the nitty-gritty details, but how to do that. But, for example, we've recently put a great deal of effort at WFMU into rebuilding our audience, because we recently lost two of our most popular programs. So we recently launched a morning show that's on drive time, and we're trying to make it sort of modeled across what used to exist in the United States a lot, which is the mom and pop owned independent radio station with a full service morning show. And it's on Monday through Friday, 6 to 9 a.m. And that's been super successful in us rebuilding our audience. And it's bringing in tons of new listeners and tons of new donors. And we're building all sorts of ways on that program to migrate those listeners to other programs by having the other programmers doing segments on the morning drive time show. And I think Pacifica could easily follow a similar model, which is to have larger amounts of programming or larger amounts of airtime dedicated to a smaller number of programs, which I think would increase the amount of audience that Pacifica can build. And then once audience is built, there's a great deal of fundraising, all sorts of methodologies that can be utilized now, which were never possible before. One of the most successful tools we do is targeted email campaigns, where we can create email lists of people who like one kind of music or another kind of music, or people who donated to one program or a group of programs, and we can tailor appeals to people based on what they've actually donated to or what they've listened to. And we can, if we have a children's program, we can alert any family that has ever ordered a small or a children's-sized T-shirt, so that we can try to build up an audience of kids, 5 to 10-year-old kids. So I think the tools that are out there available are so much more powerful than what used to be available to radio stations in terms of email marketing, and then getting giving happening on brand new platforms like Text to Give, Venmo, PayPal, as well as just regular giving on a mobile web page. So there's way more opportunities, actually, I think, for Pacifica than there ever were before. And I do think that I can't imagine a Pacifica like that, or a Pacifica station like that in the future.
Well, Ken, I was just wondering, that all sounded great, but your structure, what is the structure of the radio stations that you're working at? Like, how are these decisions made in terms of the programming?
WFMU is structured in variance to the programming philosophy, which is a free-form programming philosophy, where the programmers get to do whatever they want once they land a slot. In contrast to that, the management of the station is very normal, top-down management. The board appoints me. The board of directors appoints me as general manager. We have structures in place for getting advice and consent from all the volunteers who operate the station, but the final decision for who I hire rests with me. So we recently replaced 2 of our really key full-time people, and we did have a very, very long, involved process for interviews and narrowing the fields down from 200 down to the people who we finally hired. And that process did involve a lot of staff members, but in the end, it was my decision. Fortunately, I've never had to go against the decision of a hiring committee or any of these other advice committees that we have. It usually works out that once people are sitting around discussing the problem, there's usually unanimity or near unanimity in the decision that we utilize going forward. So that's how it works in the real world. But it is, when it comes down to it, decisions are never made by committee. Committees are there to provide advice to managers who make the decisions.
And so what is your perspective on the management structure and the governance structure of Pacifica?
Well, I think I'd agree with any observer of it that it's become fairly dysfunctional. I don't think anybody who's been paying attention to it for the last 10 years could come to any other conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Peter, do you have anything further?
Well, I'm going to talk about how that came about and some proposals to totally change it. I mean, this is jumping into my part, but we've lost $13 million in 10 years, and we're facing a $4 million bill, which in 2 years, that we have absolutely no idea how to pay, and there's a lot of whistling in the dark going on. The whole decision-making process of Pacifica has frozen since there was a crisis in '99, which I won't go into the history. There was an attempt by a non-natural takeover, and we did a wonderful thing. We democratized the whole organization, and that was a disaster. We've got to be honest about it. That was a disaster. It created forums for all kinds of little power plays, and it's so balanced with so many different bodies that no decisions get made. I can go into that more in my time. I don't want me to start that. But that's the core thing. And Pacifica will disappear under the waves in 4 years if the decision-making structure is not absolutely changed. My fundamental position is that we have to develop a consensus around the Pacifica system on one of several solutions, which I'll outline if you ask me to. And we have to change the whole structure so decisions can be made, so we can take this 1947 model Pacifica and make it run in 2018. It was a brilliant invention by Lou Hill back then, but it's still operating the way it was then because nobody can make any decisions.
All right. Ken, is there anything you'd like to add as we wrap up your portion here? I really appreciate the expertise that you have and the track record at WFMU. I looked you up in Wikipedia, and it looks like you jumped from college radio at Ann Arbor, and this has been your career. And it's really very impressive what you've achieved.
Well, thanks. Yeah, and I've definitely been very inspired my whole life in radio from Pacifica and from Lewis Hill, and then one of his disciples, Lorenzo Milam, who was a huge, important part of my my early radio career.
Mm-hmm.
Was reading his books and trying to put his ideas into practice. And so I'm a big fan of Pacifica and a big follower of Pacifica for many, many decades. And I would love to be able to help cure some of these problems.
Ken Freedman, thanks for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
WFMU demonstrates that you can reach a significant audience online without transmitters and FCC licenses. And as the value of radio stations is declining due to many factors, I believe we need to look beyond the current situation. Carole Travis joins us now via Skype. She's a member of the National Board of Pacifica. Carole, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And now I'd like you and Sharon to give a few minutes to Peter Franck, who is going to outline Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. And I want to underscore that all of our panel here tonight are dedicated to the survival and sustainability of KPFA. And you may have different ideas about how to achieve that, and we want to air that out in an honest and candid way. So Peter, let me ask you to begin and outline your ideas, please.
Okay. Well, I think we've in the last segment clearly outlined the problem. The organization hasn't been able to make decisions to modernize. It's been on a long downward slope of spending much more money than it's bringing in and being unable to make the decisions to balance the budget. 10 years ago, Nicole Sawaya, unfortunately recently passed away, was executive director for a short time, and we talked about Lou Hill in the last segment. As she resigned, she wrote a letter to Lou Hill, and I'm going to read a short part of it because it's very important that this was written 10 years ago and nothing has changed. She says to Lou Hill, "Sadly, Pacifica is no longer focused on service to the listeners, but absorbed with itself and the inhabitants therein. I call it Planet Pacifica, a term I coined during my hiring process. There is an underlying culture of grievance coupled with entitlement, and its governance structure is dysfunctional. The bylaws of the organization have opened it up to tremendous abuse, creating the opportunity for cronyism, factionalism, and faux democracy, with the result of challenging all yet helping nothing. Pacifica has been made so flat that it is concave. No leadership is possible without an enormous struggle through the inertia that committees and collectives and other things create." And believe me, it hasn't changed. What has changed, you can't lose $1.5 million a year forever. Piper has to be paid. A very bad lease was entered into with the Empire State Building. The then recent executive director of Pacifica failed to warn the interim executive director who signed that bad lease with an escalator clause. We could go on and on. It's going to disappear if we don't make drastic changes. There's various mechanisms for making changes, and I'm not going to go into those, but I believe strongly that around the whole system, we need to come to a consensus about how we're going to change things so it can work. So, my plan A, the first plan is to wrap the local boards and the community advisory boards into one entity, but have a single national election, have a small 7 or 8 person national board elected by all the members of Pacifica in one election, with a few at-large seats on that board that can be filled by it to round out its skill set. The board would appoint an executive director on an employment agreement whereby the board sets forth clear priorities and objectives, so that the basic idea, and this is in several of these plans, we need a strong executive director who can actually run the organization and not be micromanaged by the Pacifica board, and we need to protect the executive director.
And Peter, if I may, Ken Freedman described his structure at WFMU in that manner. He has advisory committees, but he ultimately makes the decisions.
That's right. Now, there's a strong feeling in Pacifica, particularly in the people more grassroots oriented, which I agree with, that there should be program councils. And I would suggest in this structure that each station have a program council, and that if a program council made a recommendation by, let's say, a 2/3 vote, that would be almost required to be put into play as a programming change. Important in either of these plans is that the executive director runs the whole organization. He can reach down to the lowliest subscription department and fire somebody if they're not doing the job. That's not the case now. They're the executive director is sort of stopped at the managerial level. Eliminating the elections on the local level, having a national election and a small board and a strong executive director, if we can come together with a consensus that, all right, let's do it that way, then we can do a bylaw amendment. We may have to get some court help from the Superior Court or the Attorney General. There's a number of ways we can get there if most of us agree. If we continue this internal warfare, the organization is just going to sink under the waves.
So that's Plan A, and
Yeah.
that is your preference. You
Right.
would prefer not to move to B or C
Right.
if the sustainability could be achieved
Right.
in that manner.
I actually, until recently, favored Plan A. Carole Spooner, 6 to 8 years ago, wrote a letter proposing a plan for a friendly divorce. I think what's incredibly important is saving the Pacifica stations, and I mean all of them. We tend to be Berkeley-centric here, but who needs the voice of Pacifica and its mission more? Berkeley, which is a very progressive town, LA, which is not so, Washington, which badly needs to hear it, New York, which is the middle media center of the world. So we've got to have stations with the Pacifica mission in all those cities. Another way to do it, if we can't come to consensus about Plan A, is to set up local nonprofits for each station, for each community, for the Pacifica board to incorporate them, for the Pacifica board to grant licenses to these nonprofits. All of this is dependent, I should have said, on, there's going to have to be some signal swapping. The only way we're going to get out of the financial mess is to exchange some of our signals, which, because they were first on the FM dial, are among the strongest. For some less strong ones, we lose some listenership, probably not a whole lot, especially given what Ken was saying about listening going to the internet. The idea is we can probably get $15 or $20 million this way, pay off the debt, give a grant to each of the new stations for its being reorganized along lines Ken was talking about or others could develop, so that we're not just spinning them off as weak stations and loaded with debt, we're spinning them off with the resources to reorganize along modern lines.
And Peter, I've reviewed your plan, and I know I've been an FCC licensee of radio stations, and you've laid it out in a way that protects this transaction or this transition from poaching by third parties who might try to cross-file at the FCC for these licenses. So we don't want to go into those details, but I just want to assure people that you've thought this through carefully, and that in a worst case, if there was a competing application, well, if the local nonprofit that has been set up is denied by the FCC, then the license reverts to Pacifica. It's not going to go to a religious entity or some commercial broadcaster.
Yeah, that's correct, and it's very important. This plan does not simply throw the 5 licenses up for grabs for anybody. Little bit of self-promotion. I've written all this up on my website, which is, this is self-promotion, www.culturelaw.com, culture law because I do entertainment law. Go to the right on that website, additional information, and all these plans are there and can be read.
And then you have a Plan C.
Plan C could be a short-term solution. We could do an amendment to the bylaws which provides for a strong executive director hired under a contract which clearly sets forth his or her goals and objectives, where the Pacifica board commits itself not to micromanage, to let that person do the job. This is standard personnel practice. Then you review in a year and you evaluate whether it's been done or not. That structure would require a grievance and appeals process so that people could, if they're complaining about what the executive director does, ultimately take it to the Pacifica board, but they'd have to go through a stepped grievance process first, because we've got to stop the Pacifica board from micromanaging, trying to micromanage, which means it just fights over people's turfs and territories. So
now, Peter, one key element of Plan B that I forgot to underscore here is that it calls for a truce. You say that this would be conditioned on the agreement of all current board members to suspend intramural fighting during the transition period. What standard would you use to measure that?
And what we're talking about is, all right, if we want to give the KPFK license to we want to make the current board of the KPFA local board, the board of the new nonprofit we'd set up in Los Angeles, they would have to agree to a moratorium on the infighting for a period of time, or we wouldn't grant the license to them. It's too technical to go into how we would define that moratorium, but we'd have to define it in terms of limits on what the board could do and how much it could micromanage.
All right. Is there anything you'd like to add before we get comments from our other panelists?
Just that it's like an airplane which is descending and descending and descending, and it's either going to spiral into the ground, and let's not kid ourselves with this happy talk. There's a very, very serious danger that it'll all crash and burn. We won't be able to pay the loans. AJC, the agency, which some people think is shady and some people think is great, will foreclose. A lot of board members are hanging their hat on a statement by a former Pacifica lawyer that they've never foreclosed on anybody. I think there's a lot of whistling in the dark. We could, all the buildings are mortgaged. The KPFA building, we're in great danger of foreclosure and shutting down. And we've got to do something. And it's one of those things where the crisis goes on so long, you think it'll go on forever. But at some point, you hit the wall. And we're getting very close to the wall. And we've got to come together, put aside petty differences. And I don't care which plan we adopt, but we have to adopt a plan and do it soon.
Peter, thank you. Sharon, let's start with you. What's your reaction to Peter's ideas?
Well, I just want to say I appreciate all that Peter has done for Pacifica over the years. And he had mentioned doing a signal swap as a potential way to sort of raise money to deal with some of these situations. And that has been an idea that's been around for several years, actually. And Peter and Carole and all of us have been talking about that for many years, and it has not happened. So, I wrote down here, it fails to account for the actuality of Pacifica. That would require people coming together and actually agreeing which signal they want to swap and agreeing to do it.
And as an outsider and looking at the bleeding,
Yeah.
it appears to me that WBAI is the station that should swap frequencies, if only to get out of the FM transmitter lease at the Empire State Building.
No,
Well, that
we're out of
was-
it. We're out of it.
That
Oh, they
was,
are? I didn't know that.
So what happened is, we are out of that lease, but that's where there's a loan for various numbers, often said to be $3.2 million. That's what that was used, was to pay off that lease. So that loan is what is hanging over Pacifica right now because it has a time frame. And this is my understanding. Of course, we haven't been privy to the details of the document, but apparently what's happening is that the interest payments right now were set aside out of the loan proceeds. So monthly payments are being made right now that were set aside out of the original $3.2 million loan proceeds. And that's going to expire at some point in the future, and there's no plan to repay. So when that happens, I believe there's 18 months. We haven't been given the loan documents, so this is all just what I understand. But after 18 months, when the proceeds that have been set aside are depleted, there is no plan to repay. So I really appreciate all that Peter has done for so many, many years for Pacifica. But from my perspective, I don't see that happening because we suggested a signal swap a few years ago, and we were in a better position then to do it, and it didn't happen.
But you're not opposed to it.
I'm not opposed to a signal swap.
Okay, all right. And what other elements of Peter's plan do you agree or disagree with, Sharon?
I don't have a lot of information on his plans. I just feel like what's going to happen is the loans are going to become due, the $3.2 million loans that are in addition to many of the other loans and money that are owed by the Pacifica Corporation. And personally, I think that since we hear over and over that the economic crisis is coming our way, I do believe that those two things will come together to create quite a crisis for Pacifica. So I would like to see a solution that deals with that reality.
All right. Anything else you want to add at this
Not
point?
right now.
Okay. Carole Travis, you're a member of the Pacifica National Board. Give us your perspective on the state of play today and on Peter Franck's proposals.
Okay, let's see. Pacifica is dysfunctional. The national board is dysfunctional. I agree with that. I think I'm about to go.
Well,
You're
you're
back.
back.
Am I back?
You
Yes.
survived. You had a mini rapture.
Yeah.
Okay. I have that all the time.
Please continue.
So usually people don't notice it. So, but I am oddly both more negative and more positive. It's an odd combination, but there it goes again.
No, you're on.
Yeah.
We didn't lose you.
Okay, all right. The way in which I am positive, well, let me say something about me, because I think that the dysfunction has to do with the habits of toxic factional fighting. And I think that really at KPFA, until very recently, for a series of reasons, including that we're going into an election season, but and also the way in which we attempted to put people on the board last year as people were dropped off, led to some people getting on and some more fighting than we've had recently. We were famous for fighting, largely because Peter Franck made efforts at reaching out to do some cross-factional discussions that then both Sharon and I and many others became a part of, really changed the way in which we were functioning at KPFA, and still has an impact in terms of how we function and talk with each other. Because, for example, the three of us agree on some things and disagree very much on other things, but we have a commitment and a habit to speak to each other respectfully and to try and work on the problems at hand. And when I first became aware of what was going on the national board, I tended to avoid it because it had such a horrific reputation. I think that the national board, as it was going into the crisis with the Empire State Building, was not talking about crisis or money or structure or anything like that. And today there is a hefty, healthy conversation, to the extent we have conversations in the national board about the structure and about the necessity to talk about that. There's discussions about the size of the boards, the role of the LSBs, the role of the whole shebang. In a lot of ways, the dysfunction serves all of the stations that are not fiscally self-sustaining, because the dysfunction prevents any intervention by central management. And what it does is it drains those stations that make money, which includes KPFA. So there's an interest to some degree in the PNB as it's structured now to continue with the dysfunction, but there's also genuine distrust and antagonism, some of them rooted in history that I know nothing about, thank you, although I'm identified with some of it, and some in actual witnessed distrustful behavior, which I have some distrust of some people, and I think a lot of people have some distrust of me because of my central role in Big Tent Radio Network. But there's also distrust based on race in Pacifica at large. I mean, I think that there's, and I think that distrust by people of color of white people in the United States is something that is understandable, but it's a complicating factor in all the other elements of distrust and parochial lenses that each group that comes from each different station has in looking at what we're doing. But in the last 10 months, because for the first time in, I understand, decades, and this is hearsay because I haven't been around decades, we had a professional manager. And so there's a whole bunch of things that have been put into place that are beginning to get the basic business functioning things in place that miraculously Pacifica has survived for decades without. I mean, the lists, the financial record keeping, the ability to get the records between stations, to get national records and so on, to do the audits easily through, clicking buttons on computers to get data is getting in place. It's not totally in place, but it's getting in place in a way that is miles and miles and miles ahead of where it was 10 months, even 11 months ago. So that's good news. And the way in which I'm optimistic is that I am very much a supporter of Pacifica. I don't think that KPFA even though I appreciate it to an extent that I think a lot of people who have spent a lot of time with it don't appreciate it, because I came from Chicago where no such station existed. And so it's miraculous to me kind of what the range of programs are on KPFA. But I don't think it's important that Berkeley has a station like that, even though I love KPFA. Because the planet is at risk, because the fascists are at the gate, because wealth inequality is rampant, because all of the things that we know that are horrible that are happening. And I think there's a a group of people who see Pacifica as their political work, rather than Pacifica as a communication network for people who are doing political work in all the areas of housing, poverty, jails, starvation and genocide in Yemen, or whatever. And I actually think that there is a potential, given the 5 stations, the 5 media markets that we're in, and that are big and also important. That is the capital of capitalism, the federal government, the oil and gas industry, the entertainment industry, the tech industry, our incredible archives, and our 220 plus affiliates across the United States, which are very important and mean that we have the capacity to be a network. I think that a network rooted in the communities more deeply than some of our stations are, but also with some national programming, that we could be useful. And if we had useful national programming that enabled all the siloed issued groups that are exploding at this time of tremendous political activity, and gave them a platform to talk to each other in an intersectional fashion, that New York City could raise $3.2 or $3.7 or $4.2 million in 10 minutes. Beto raised $43 million in Texas, and we're not useful. And I think that if we don't become useful, then it doesn't matter whether Pacifica survives. But I think we can survive. I think there's a place for us. I think there's a need for us. I think there's a hunger for us. And I think that the discussions that are beginning to happen on structure are central to that survival, and that the bylaw changes that all the members are going to have to become familiar with and take a stand on enable us to have a chance to become what we need in this world today, which is a frightening place.
So, Carole, could I just ask you to enumerate, do you support Peter's proposal for a strong executive and to dial back the role of the board in attempting to manage the individual stations?
Yes.
Okay.
Although I also, we're in any executive coming in right now has a rat's nest of problems. And so it's really, we need a transitional thing where some of these problems can be solved somehow. But I do think we need a strong executive. Yes, okay. I do support that.
And do you support the signal swap proposal?
No, I don't. I did. And if it's the thing that has to happen, no. I think New York is a central place of the progressive radio, and my understanding about how the areas that we would lose because of the buildings, the valleys and the buildings, that we would lose more listeners than we understood. I mean, if we have to do that, yes, I support it. But I'm hopeful and I'm one of the people that Peter referred to who says blithely, John Kriegler says that they've never, ever called in a default loan, and that they're really interested in public media. And the fact that we have now a new executive director who's a radio man, who's an African American radio manager, and I'm hoping that he does a lot of stuff on programming for us and gets us going so that we can get money.
All right. Peter has a question for you.
Well, you sort of asked my question. Which of my plans or some other plan would you support in terms of reorganizing and restructuring Pacifica? I think you're wrong in thinking that we can diddle around with it here and there and solve these problems without a...
I don't think we can diddle around with it. I think it has to be a real serious restructure. I agree with that.
Okay. What structural change would you support?
Well, I think there's probably different ways to do things. I think yours is one good one. That is a national election, and some at-large ones. You know, some people elected from each of the 5 stations, and you know, some national slots is a fine idea. I agree with you. I believe, although I think it's probably not going to pass, but I believe that the LSBs should be folded into the cabs. I don't know what I think about a program council. I think that I'm somebody who believes in professional radio. That may be a place where we disagree. I think that, you know, reporters who are journalism school reporters who are paid and union members and so forth are an important part of a professional network that's needed by the progressive community, which is not to say that I don't think that the volunteers are very important to Pacifica. We have survived this far, and I think that we need them continuing. But I think, you know, we need professional management, and that's why I support your position on, you know, supporting the manager.
Sharon?
Well, I believe I heard Carole say something to the extent that, you know, KPFA is one of the, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but, you know, that she was giving a lot of support for the New York station. And in my opinion, the New York station is incredibly dysfunctional, yet their executive director remains in charge. But the national board did manage to vote to exclude KPFA members from many of its committees. For example, I am the treasurer of KPFA right now, but I'm not allowed to participate on the finance committee. So, you know, there's this certain sense where the national board can take action, retribution or something, you know, for things.
And what is the basis for that exclusion?
It had to do, honestly, it's like so... It had to do with how we were trying to fill vacancies on our board. I mean, and why the national, which has all these huge issues that they're facing, why they have to like all of a sudden come crashing down into our local station board and how we're operating and, you know, use that as a basis of excluding us, me, the treasurer, from the national committees. You know, that just shows some of the dysfunction, excuse me, that is happening at that level. And so, I just would like to say that, you know, KPFA is one of the most financially solvent stations, but there's this sense that we are excluded. And I just think that the structure of Pacifica is extremely dysfunctional, and we are running out of time because these loans are going to come due. The economy as a whole is, you know, coming to a crisis. And things are going to shake out. And I don't want to put words in Carole's mouth, but I personally believe that KPFA is the most important station. And I want to protect KPFA. I'm not entirely convinced that that loan was, you know, handed out in good faith. And I didn't agree with the loan to begin with. So that's all I have to say for now.
All right. Carole, please respond.
Well, I agree with Sharon that she should not, and KPFA should not have been excluded from the national board, and have, you know, tried to raise that again a number of times. But in any case, I agree with her on that. I don't think I said a lot of strong things supporting WBAI BAI is, I said I didn't think that we should swap it unless we had to, because of the strength of its signal and because New York is a very wealthy, very progressive town. And so if we could get the station to be functional, which it is totally dysfunctional right now, it has 5 people who are on the staff who are paid. Summer Reese some years ago fired the whole staff that was doing all of the work, and it just is, it's crashed and burned. Nobody listens to it.
Excuse me, but I really need to make the point that, New York, which is in the New York City, has a listenership, a paid listener, paid membership of approximately 7,000 people, whereas we in the Bay Area have something like 17,000 here at KPFA. So I mean, I always hear these things, and I'm not saying that I just think we have to look at the reality of what's happening. It would be great. It would be great if New York was a powerful station, but right now, it's a very, very weak station.
We don't disagree.
So let me say something about this. We're never going to solve the problem on this granular level. The problem that Sharon points out, that the KPFA people with the most money, and she's the treasurer, are excluded because of all this politics on the PNB from doing her job and contributing to the solvency and the rationality of Pacifica, is just an example. We have to either come together around one of the structural proposals and convince, all of us should be traveling more, convince people elsewhere of solution A, B, C, I don't care which one, or at some point some of us lawyers are going to have to get together and put Pacifica into a receivership. And I think that's a real possibility. That may be the only way out. It's not the best way out.
Carole, you want to comment?
I think that I don't, Peter has looked at this and so have some others. I think that going after breaking KPFA out, looking at the structure and the bylaws and so on, is a very costly endeavor and is likely to fail. And I think, and also, as I said before, I really think that what's needed in this country, on this planet, in this place, in the United States today, is Pacifica. And so I'm not focused at all on how do we break KPFA away, even though I love and think it is the most functional and the best.
All right. And Carole, you described encouragement by the conversations that you have seen taking place. Do they include detailed discussions about restructuring in the manner that Peter Franck is proposing?
They have begun. We had one session where we had in the PNB where we had a discussion about what do people think about the bylaws and so on. And we have a discussion about having 1 or 2 more of those, and we are setting up a timeline for bylaw changes to put pressure on us to have bylaw discussions.
But to be clear,
there's been a survey. There is a website that was set up not by the PNB, but by one of the members of the PNB, Bill Crozier, that took a survey on what do you think about the size, the function, the alternatives, and so on. So that there is discussion that's going on not only in the meetings, but along on the side by people, about what are we going to do about the structure and the importance of the change of the structure.
But Carole, to be clear, are there active proposals being discussed, or is this just cocktail conversation?
Oh, it's not cocktail conversation. I had some proposals. Because of what happened with some other things that were going on, I put them aside for a while. But I have proposals. Bill Crozier has proposals. Carole Wolfley has proposals. Peter Franck has proposals. Other people have proposals. And we're trying to set up timelines so that as the proposals come forward, it also makes time available for other proposals to come forward and to have a rich and full discussion among the people and the membership. I mean, Carole Wolfley's proposal is one that's rooted in looking at getting a membership petition going so that it goes directly to the membership, irrespective of what happens in the PNB.
Well,
So
respectfully,
it's not just cocktail conversation.
and this is not personal to you, Carole, but the description you offer is highly bureaucratic and does not appear to recognize the impending crisis that has been forestalled, but only temporarily.
Which impending crisis are you speaking of?
The loan.
The
$4
loan, the
million.
dysfunction,
Well, the bylaws that we're talking about having a bylaw thing come in on December 7th, and a bylaw periods begin then, and another bylaw period begin around December 27th, so that we're setting up two bylaw periods, and we're numbers of us are developing different bylaws to put in, and the loan is talking about 2 years away. So it's ahead of where you're talking about the impending crisis is.
All right. Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I just want to say, I mean, of course, we have not been given the loan documents. I mean, Carole has seen them because she's on the PNB, but outside the PNB, we haven't seen them. But my understanding is that for the first 18 months, the payments are being made out of some money that was set aside out of the original loan amount that was taken out. And after 18 months, we will have to actually come up with money, not just set aside money.
Money from cash flow.
Yes, and there is no plan to do that, as I understand. And also, so we're about 6 months into it, so we have another year. And once that rolls around, I mean, where is the money going to come from? And on the various Pacifica lists, change the programming, do this, do that. But the Pacifica structure remains dysfunctional currently. So, yeah.
Carole, you were trying to get in. I'm sorry.
I was just saying that she is correct that in 18 months, which is in about a year now, that we have to pay monthly payments. And then the loan itself as an entirety comes due in 3 years from when the loan was taken. So it's a very short-term loan, and it is a lot of pressure.
And
but
it's a balloon.
Also,
it has to be paid off.
I mean, we're doing the bylaw changes and the structure changes and pushing heavily on structure changes. I term out in January. So, I'm gone then, and I'm pushing very hard with a lot of other people, including Peter, on bylaw changes and structure changes and the necessity for this immediately.
Mm-hmm. Now, before our time runs out here, Sharon, I wanted to turn to you because when we announced that we were going to do this program, I received a number of emails and comments, particularly from KPFA listeners who are upset by the programming changes, including Bonnie Faulkner's local program, Guns and Butter, and the manner in which this has occurred. And I've heard reports that the local board meetings, there are now new rules where members are not permitted to videotape or stream the proceedings, and they complain that they haven't been able to access fundamental financial reports and things of that nature. So the description doesn't seem consistent with the democratic governance model and the free speech mantra of Pacifica and KPFA.
So regarding the Guns and Butter situation, let me just say I was a fan of Bonnie's show and I listened to it regularly. And prior to this thing that led to the removal of the show, I was listening to the show one day when she said, she had a guest that said that there was a massive amount of water underneath the Earth's crust. I'm a former scientist. And it was locked up in the form of OH. And maybe water is H2O. So I just took quite I really didn't agree with that position since it was scientifically wrong, and I emailed Bonnie and she just kind of dismissed it. I mean, she responded and we had a little conversation, but she did not acknowledge that it was scientifically incorrect, and there was no correction made. And there's been other situations like that with Guns and Butter. Now, I'm a fan of the show, okay? I actually like the show. But
So
there didn't.
the allegation is that she didn't rise to the standards of the station? Is that it?
I mean, I don't want to say what the allegation was. It was that, I mean, I actually have it right here. We have a report out. The KPFA-LSB investigated the removal of Guns and Butter from the KPF airwaves, and the majority of the LSB agreed that journalistic standards were not followed and that progressive discipline processes were followed, and that the majority support the general manager. Because we did have an executive session where we discussed some ongoing situations where it seemed that things were not, it wasn't like it was being balanced. There was just one side that was being presented.
Okay.
Could I say something?
Please.
And this is a position that's, I think, different than Sharon's. And although it supports the I'm on the KPFA board, also the LSB also, and support the position of the LSB. But I'd like to say further that one of the shows she had on without any discussion and without any, I can't remember the words we used, but any journalistic interaction where she just played something where the Parkland students were accused of being paid Soros actors, and but this particular show that was the last straw. It was a show that she did a whole speech by somebody. And she pulled, as the only thing she did was she pulled a teaser that she put in the front, and that teaser was aired after she said, "This is Guns and Butter, and here's the teaser," and then the whole speech was done. And in the speech, a lot of people have talked about the fact that it had Holocaust denier guy who said that the trainloads of bodies in Dachau were phony photographs, and that people in Dachau were actually walking around in nice clothes and well fed. But the thing that I objected to even more than that was the teaser she pulled was something that said, Iran's on the table now. And the only way that we're going to be freed of the Israel lobby is if we attack Iran. And as a result of that, the American people get bloodied and then turn on the Israel lobby. And that's the only way we're going to get free of this. And that was the teaser. And so this guy was, let me finish, Peter. This guy was advocating a preemptive strike on another country. And he was advocating it supposedly so that we would be freed of the Israel lobby. And this was to do something that the Israel lobby is arguing that we should do, that is a preemptive strike on Iran. And there was never a discussion about what would happen to the Iranian people. And the reason it would work is because we would become bloodied. Well, that does not belong on Pacific Airways, in my opinion. That is a preemptive war and insanity, madness like that, broadcast as if that's something that doesn't belong on Pacific Airwaves.
Peter?
This is a discussion that we shouldn't be having, because it's not a board level discussion of do we like this program or do we not like this program. The only question should be were proper procedures followed in removing the program, and I've heard different stories about that. I don't know, but for us to be on this show talking about how we disagreed with a particular speaker, no matter how much we disagree, I think is really off track to what we need to be focused on.
Well, I take your point, but at the same time, I asked about this.
Yes,
and,
you did.
I think that Sharon did give us her views on it.
I actually supported Bonnie's show. That's why I reached out to her to say what I said to her.
Mm-hmm.
I listened to the show regularly, and I was kind of bummed when it was removed.
Mm-hmm.
So,
all right, and just to the other point, have there been new restrictions placed on people videotaping the local board meetings?
we never had a policy, and of course, all of the local station board meetings are available online on kpftx.org. And what we didn't want was people with the video cameras taking segments and, you know, maybe distorting what has happened. Because, for example, I mean, maybe to say something slightly controversial, I don't know if you've heard about the Julian Assange motion that was came up before the KPFA-LSB. But, you know, it originally was written only directed towards KPFA, you know, and we don't have any real input into that. And we tried to pass, we on the LSB did try to pass a resolution that supported Assange, and yet still there's all this dissension about that. So I'm not quite sure why I started to say that, except that it's, I try to keep it, when we're on the board, I want to just deal with the radio station. And I think a lot of this extraneous stuff is just extraneous. And in this instance, maybe personally, I wouldn't have removed Guns and Butter, but I supported Quincy McCoy, our general manager, in doing his in his decision on Guns
Well,
and
and I
Butter.
think that's an interesting example of the need to have strong management
Yeah.
and to support their decisions, even when there is pushback or fallout from listeners.
All right.
And you know, this is a model that we have to see expanded, I believe, if Pacifica is to be sustainable and you know, making the contributions that we all wish to see. Let me ask each for a final comment, and Peter, I'll start with you.
Well, I would really urge us to lift our eyes onto the horizon, so to speak. We aren't going to solve this problem on this small area and by the PNB once in a while talking about bylaws. We're going to have to come together over some concept and push it out through the whole system. If we don't do that, we will come crashing down. I mean, this $4 million loan will be due in 24
years.
months, and fantasies are being promoted about, well, if the programming gets better. We're not paying our bills now.
Exactly.
And we're never going to be able to come up with $4 million. And the worst thing to do is a fire sale of the frequencies. You know, various people have talked to various brokers. I don't agree with Carole Travis's pessimism about the swap. It should be now being carefully planned as part of a fundamental reorganization plan.
Well, and I support that. I think proactive steps are needed, because otherwise the dysfunction will allow the problems to fester until the whole thing goes over a cliff, and then you lose everything. And that, to me, is the big risk. Carole Travis?
I guess what I would say is, even though it's going to be annoying, I hope that you have another show and that we have some detailed discussion about the boring structure changes, so that there can be participation of members to understand the various choices, and so that we can do make some votes on structure. Because actually, if we mobilize the KPFA membership to have a strong position on some structure changes that are meaningful, and all of our people vote, with just some voting in some of the other areas that go along with us, we can make some structure changes that will matter, like the ones that Peter suggested about the role of the executive director, which is a critical one.
Thank you.
So I hope you have some more shows.
All right,
Yes,
Sharon?
yeah, thank you for doing this. Well, I really, I don't know what to say, because, you know, it was interesting to listen to Ken Freedman, but, you know, he's, from what I gather, basically in charge. So who knows what will happen when he's gone from his radio station. And Pacifica suffers from the opposite problem, which it has, you know, multiple generals, and everybody wants a decision. So, I mean, the signal swap idea, I've agreed with it. I've agreed with it for many years, but it was shot down. And it, you know, when it could have happened, it didn't happen, and I don't see how it's going to happen now. I mean, I appreciate all the hard work Carole has done on the national board. It's not easy, and, you know, so I'm trying to remain optimistic, but I just don't see a lot of real change. And if I just could say one thing, one point that I brought, which is I brought this I think that we need to look at how we are trying to get money out of our radio stations. For example, some programs have situations where they generate money on the side. And that's maybe somewhere where we could look at a different model. I think there's something within the model that is currently being put out that needs to be redone, but I'm not sure that we're going to be able to do it before this loan is due.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank each of you for joining us for this important discussion. Sharon Adams, Peter Franck, and Carole Travis. Thank you for being with us for this special broadcast. And feel free to respond. I'm going to give out my email address, and if you would like to share your comments with me, I will pass them along to the other participants. My email is peter@peterbcollins.com. Thank you for joining us for this special program.
And thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.